This conference will now be recorded.
So before I start, one thing I just want to put in the chat is the link on how to access all the information for the call for projects. So I believe all of you should have received, or most everybody should have received this information, but you, on the website that I just posted in the chat, you're able to download the applications, the guidebook, and everything. So if you wanted to follow along with some of what I will be going over today, you can go ahead and look at that guidebook that's linked within that website. All right, so welcome to the 2023 Call for Projects Applicant Training Workshop. So just a few of the things that we're going to be going over today. I'm going to give an overview of the Call for Projects, go over the project requirements for all of the funding programs, then talk about program-specific requirements, the scoring criteria. Then I'll bring up the application and give an overview of the application, and then do a demonstration of the application data tool. And then the end of the meeting will just be for open question and answers. As a reminder, this meeting will be recorded and we will post the video recording of the meeting on that website, the Call for Projects website, so that you can reference anything that we talked about today and that application tool demonstration throughout the entire Call for Projects. So first, I just want to present to everybody the funding estimates that we have available for this call. As a reminder, we are awarding funding to the 4 federal funding programs. So the first is the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. We have about $10.9 million that we are awarding. Then we have the Surface Transportation Block Grant, which is about $9.6 million. Transportation Alternatives, which is $934,000, and then the Carbon Reduction Program, which is $2.5 million. So total, we're looking at about $24 million that we're going to be awarding in this call. So first, just wanted to go over quickly the schedule for the call for projects. So the call opened last Friday, and then the first deadline that we have is going to be the project descriptions, which are due on Friday, August 25th. And as a reminder, all applicants are required to submit the project description to the NFRMPO. And then certain projects are required to also submit their project descriptions to CDOT. And those are going to be projects that are impacting or located on a state facility, and then also ITS projects are required to submit the project descriptions to CDOT. The next due date will be for carbon reduction and CMAQ projects. You will, after you submit the project description, the NFRMPO will send the air quality data request form to you, and those will be due back to us on September 8th. And then also, if from the project description, staff looks at your project and it qualifies for the single occupant vehicle analysis, we will also send that form to you, and that will also be due on September 8th. The final applications will be due on Friday, October 6th, and then we will have the scoring criteria for CMAQ, STBG, and the carbon reduction program on Wednesday, November 1st. The invitation to that meeting was sent out last week, and as a reminder, the scoring committee will be made up of required to be project applicants, so one representative from each of our TAC member agencies is allowed to be on the scoring committee, even if you do not submit an application. But if your community has submitted an application, you are required to be on that scoring committee meeting for those 3 funding programs. That meeting will be held at the Windsor Recreation Center, and for anybody who did not receive that, please email me and I will make sure to send that invitation to you. The scoring committee meeting for the Transportation Alternatives Program will be at the regularly scheduled NoCo Bike and Ped Collaborative meeting on Wednesday, November 8th. Another date that I want to make sure everybody is aware of is the council meeting in December will be council's discussion of the recommended projects, and applicants who have been selected for funding will need to present during that meeting. So you'll want to make sure to mark that on your calendar to make sure that you're available during that meeting. All right. Next, I wanted to talk about the local match requirements. So for all 4 of these federal funding programs, the required local match is 17.21%. And as a reminder, that is based on the federal request and the required local match. So the calculation for figuring out what that local match requirement is shown on the screen here. Also, when we look at the applications, I do have that calculation, the formula within the application, so you'll be able to calculate based on that. There are a few exceptions for the local match requirement that are listed within the guidebook, but then also if you have any questions about whether or not your project qualifies for that exception, please contact us and we can talk through that. So I wanted to quickly go over the requirements for all of the projects within this call for projects. So first, any of the projects must be within the NFRMPO planning area and also must be on one of our 2050 RTP regional corridors and consistent with the corridor visions within the 2050 RTP. As I mentioned before, if a project impacts a state facility or is an ITS project, CDOT must provide concurrence on that project, and so you have to submit the project descriptions to CDOT so that they can get you that letter. And that letter must be also returned with your final project application. Next, all projects must address at least one federal or regional performance measure, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more specifically when I go into all of the funding programs. Your project must comply with all applicable land use plans and corridor studies, and then ITS projects must also comply with CDOT ITS planning documents. The projects submitted for the call for projects must complete a construction or an implementation phase. Also, all projects must not require a Vehicle Buy America waiver. And then all projects must meet all required deadlines. For any projects that miss a deadline or are submitted past a deadline, I just want to note that that will be something that will have to be discussed at the scoring committee meeting, and the scoring committee might take that into consideration when making final selections or making final recommendations on projects. So a requirement for all the projects is that you must complete a full application workbook. And so as opposed to previous calls where we've had the fillable PDFs, this time we have an Excel workbook that has these 5 different tabs that have the requirements for all projects. So I'll go into all of the details about those tabs and walk through that later, but it's the project description, project requirements, project justification, the performance measure impact, and equity analysis worksheets. Additionally, you'll have to submit a detailed cost estimate, a project location map, letters of support, and then for projects that qualify, the CDOT letter of concurrence and the SOV analysis. So now I'll go into the details about each of the funding programs, and this is just really an overview of all of the funding programs. More of the details are available in the guidebook. So first is CMAQ, and so we have about $5 million in each of the years that we will be awarding, and the maximum request is 50% of the total CMAQ funding that is available. So your maximum request per agency is that $5.4 million. Minimum request for the CMAQ program is $100,000. So some of the requirements that are specific to the CMAQ program are that a project must demonstrate an air quality benefit for the North Front Range. Within your application, you must include the air quality data request form and air quality benefit worksheet. As a reminder, that data request form will be sent to eligible projects following submission of the project description, and then the air quality benefit worksheet will also be sent by NFR MPO staff to project applicants after we complete that analysis. So like with all projects, the sponsors must submit the project description to us no later than August 25th, end of day, and we will then send the CMAQ emissions worksheets within, I believe, that next week. For the CMAQ program, the projects must contribute to the achievement of one or more federally required performance measure. As far as eligible project types, I'm not going to go into all of the project types that are eligible under each of the funding programs, but I am going to highlight the project types that are new from the bipartisan infrastructure law. So just going to highlight some of those new project types. But for a full list of all of the eligible project types, you'll want to see each of the sections within the Call for Projects guidebook. So for the CMAQ program, CMAQ funding may be used for projects or programs which will contribute to the attainment of National Ambient Air Quality Standard with a high effectiveness in reducing air pollution. A couple of the new things from the bipartisan infrastructure law is that transit operating assistance has no time limitation for non-urbanized areas and urbanized areas with a population of less than 200,000. Once again, if you have any questions about that specifically, I would recommend you reach out to me so that we can discuss that. And then the second new project type is shared micromobility, including bike sharing and shared scooter systems. That's eligible under CMAQ. So next we'll talk about the Surface Transportation Block Grant. We have about $9.6 million. So one of the things I want to point out is that for STBG and carbon reduction program, we have a certain amount of funding that is available prior to fiscal year 2026, and so that's what you have in that rolled funding column there. Some of it is fiscal year 2024 and some of it is fiscal year 2025. By the time we finish this process, we're going to be pretty close to the beginning of fiscal year 2025, so you can pretty much count on utilizing those funds within fiscal year 2025. So the maximum request for the STBG program is based on whether or not you qualify as a small community or a large community. And that is all listed in the guidebook on which communities are considered small and which are large. The large communities are any of those communities that are have a population of 50,000 or greater. So for small communities, the maximum request is $1.6 million. And for large communities, it's about $3.2 million. The minimum request is $100,000. And then also for any agency that is not, that is our partner agencies or not one of our NFRMPO member communities, that maximum request is $1 million. So requirements for the STBG program, once again, you have to submit the project description by August 25th. There will be certain projects which qualify for the SOV analysis, and so those also must be returned by that deadline. And then for the STBG program, projects must contribute to the achievement of at least one or more federally required performance measure. Looking at the new eligible project types under the STBG program, is wildlife crossing structures, the addition or retrofitting of structures to eliminate or reduce crashes involving wildlife, maintenance and restoration of existing recreational trails, installation of EV charging infrastructure, installation and deployment of current and emergent intelligent transportation technologies, the planning and construction of projects that facilitate intermodal connections between emerging transportation technologies, such as magnetic levitation and Hyperloop. I know that's something that everybody was interested in applying for. The next set is protective features, including natural infrastructure to enhance resilience of an eligible transportation facility, measures to protect eligible transportation facility from cybersecurity threats, conducting value for money analysis or similar comparative analysis of public-private partnerships, projects to enhance travel and tourism, replacement of low water crossings with a bridge not on a federal highway, and then capital projects for the construction of bus rapid transit corridor or dedicated bus lanes. So those are all the new eligible requirements under the STBG program. But once again, the full list of eligible projects is listed out in the guidebook. All right, for the carbon reduction program, we have about $2.5 million of the funding available to award, and the maximum request for all communities is $2.5 million, so the full 100% of the funding available. The minimum request is $100,000. For requirements under the carbon reduction program, projects must demonstrate a greenhouse gas benefit for the North Front Range. Within your application, you must include the air quality data request and the air quality benefit worksheet. The project description is due on August 25th. And then also the project must contribute to the achievement of one or more federally required performance measure. Because the carbon reduction program is a new program from the bipartisan infrastructure law, all of the project types are new project types. So I just wanted to highlight some of the project types available under the carbon reduction program. So all projects must contribute to the reduction of transportation emissions. So carbon dioxide emissions from on-road highway sources is the specifics of that project. So a few things that you're able to use that for are projects to establish or operate traffic monitoring, management, and control facility programs, public transportation projects, including capital projects. From our understanding of the carbon reduction program, this is that they are not eligible to be used for operating costs, just the capital costs for public transportation projects. Anything that is eligible under the Transportation Alternatives Project or program is eligible under carbon reduction. Also, advanced transportation and congestion management technologies. Projects for the deployment of infrastructure-based intelligent transportation systems. Projects to replace street lighting and traffic control devices with energy-efficient alternatives. Projects or strategies designed to support congestion pricing, shifting transportation demand to non-peak hours or other transportation modes, increasing vehicle occupancy rates or otherwise reducing demand for roads, including electronic toll collection and travel demand management strategies and programs. Next is efforts to reduce the environmental and community impacts of freight movement. And then last is projects to support the deployment of alternative fuel vehicles. So this is the capital costs for the acquisition, installation, or operation of publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure or hydrogen, natural gas, or propane vehicle infrastructure. And then the purchase or lease of zero-emission construction equipment and vehicles. Next is also diesel engine retrofits. And lastly is certain types of projects to improve travel flow eligible under the CMAQ program that do not involve the construction of new capacity. There are some details within each of these project types that reference different, reference the CMAQ program and transportation alternatives. So I would recommend looking at those details within the guidebook if you have a question on whether or not your project is eligible under the carbon reduction program. All right, lastly, we will talk about the Transportation Alternatives Program. So we have about $934,000 to award for this call. The maximum request is 100% of the available funding, and the minimum request for the TA program is $50,000. Requirements for the TA program are to submit the project description by August 25th. If your project impacts a state facility, you will need to get CDOT concurrence. Projects must be consistent with the corridor visions from the 2021 Active Transportation Plan. And for the TA program, a project must contribute to the achievement of one or more federally required or regional performance measures. So this the TA program is the only program that the requirement is not for it meeting a federal required performance measure. You can also only contribute to the achievement of a regional performance measure. So just wanted to highlight that. And then as far as new TA eligible project types, the only one is activities in furtherance of a vulnerable road user safety assessment. Before I go into looking at the scoring criteria, I just wanted to pause for a second to see if there were any questions about any of the funding programs that we just discussed. Elizabeth?
Go back to that last slide and explain to me what kind of study what that means.
I'm sorry, I couldn't really hear what you said.
What? Can you go back to that last slide? What is what does it mean, the furtherance of what is that?
So specifically a vulnerable road user safety assessment is something that relates to the HSIP program. So vulnerable road users being defined as pedestrians, cyclists, or people on human-powered devices, so like scooters, things like that. So states must conduct a vulnerable road user safety assessment if their VRU fatalities and serious injuries are over 15% of the total of the state. And so any of the strategies that would be identified in that vulnerable road user safety assessment would be eligible under the TA program. Most likely, it's not going to be anything really different from other TA program activities, but that is the specific wording that they added to the TA program. So I'm not sure if that really helped, but that's what that is.
So we've got a copy of that vulnerable road user safety assessment for the MPO.
So I know that CDOT is currently in the process of developing a vulnerable road user safety assessment, but I don't think they've finalized it yet.
Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
No problem. Any other questions about any of the funding programs? All right. If not, I would just encourage, if you do have any questions that come up on whether or not you think your project is eligible under a certain funding program, please reach out to me and we can discuss that. So I wanted to talk about the scoring criteria. I won't go into details about all of it. We've talked about that pretty in depth, and within the Call for Projects guidebook, under each of the funding programs, you'll find the scoring criteria listed. But there are a few things that I wanted to highlight with the scoring criteria. So first, we have organized the scoring criteria for this call based on the goals that have been identified for the 2050 Regional Transportation Plan. So it's organized based on safety, regional health, mobility, multimodal, and operations. So this is the matrix for all of the funding programs. You'll see that CMAQ and carbon reduction are the same weighting. The one difference will be for the CMAQ program, you're looking at ozone benefits, and for the carbon reduction, you're looking at greenhouse gas benefits. And then in addition to those 5 goal areas, we also have discretionary points that will be, so it's 5 points across the board for all funding programs, and that is based on the discretion of the scoring committee. And so each individual person submitting one of those scoring workbooks for the scoring committee will be able to award those points based on the discretion of looking through the application and all of the narratives and allowing to award those points. So a couple of things that I wanted to highlight in the scoring criteria are under the air quality emissions reductions. What I have on the screen there is that the lowest cost per ton will receive the highest amount of points, and the highest cost per ton will receive the lowest amount of points. And those thresholds will be defined based on the projects that are submitted. So we will do those calculations, and then within the we will send to everybody what those thresholds will be based on the projects that are being submitted. If there are any questions about any of the criteria that I am not highlighting, please either raise your hand or go ahead and just unmute to ask your question. The next that I wanted to highlight is under safety. For the crash rate, that is going to be similar to the air quality emissions, where the highest crash rate would receive the highest amount of points. The lowest crash rate will receive the lowest amount of points. And one of the things I also wanted to highlight within this is some of the discussions that we'd had at our TAC meetings about areas that don't have a crash rate at their project location. And so that crash rate is going to be based on the weighted crash score, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and the volume of traffic at the project location. If you have no history of fatal or serious injury crashes at your project location, you are able to select a surrogate location. So a location within the region that has similar characteristics to your project location. So for instance, if you are constructing a safe crossing of a trail across a major road, you could look at similar project locations for places that have a trail crossing a road with a similar volume. I would recommend that if anybody is interested in taking advantage of that, to reach out to us so that we can talk through what that surrogate location looks like. Another thing that we had discussed is if your project location does not have the crash history and you are unable to find a good example of a surrogate location, there will be an opportunity to receive points based on the narrative that you include in your application, and that will be determined by the scoring committee as a whole, whether or not to award a certain amount of points so as to not penalize, good projects that are being proactive for not having crash rates. But that will be based on the voting members of the scoring committee, whether or not that any project qualifies for those additional points. And that was really all I wanted to highlight as far as the scoring criteria. So before I go into looking at the application, I just wanted to pause again to see if there was any questions about the presentation that I have gone over so far. All right, I will go ahead and give me just a second. So the question is in the chat for CMAQ applications to cover transit operations, how are crash rates evaluated? One of what we had talked about with the TAC is that under that, let's see, so within safety, the crash rates wouldn't be awarded to those types of projects that are not for those types of transit projects. There would be the option of talking about possibly contributing to the achievement of the transit safety performance measures, but then also within your narrative talking about safety contributions of, increasing transit use could be part of that proactive intervention or countermeasure. But there are other areas of transit operations projects that are going to receive points in other, some of the other goal areas that, other projects wouldn't get points for. But let me know if there was any other questions about that. All right. If there are no other questions about the presentation, I will go ahead and switch over to the application. All right, so as I mentioned, the application is housed within this workbook. And so the first tab we have is instructions, and then there are 5 tabs that will need to be filled out for your final project application. So first is the project description, and this project description will be included in your final application. This first tab of the project description is also what will be due on August 25th. And as I've mentioned, that's due to the NFR-MPO for our review, but then for projects that qualify, this project description would also be due to CDOT. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but a couple things I wanted to highlight is that let me go back to the instructions tab. The legend down at the bottom here shows that there are different colors for the cells within the workbook. And so the yellow color are sections that must be filled out by the project sponsor. That's kind of short answer text that will need to be filled out. The gray options, the gray boxes are where there's drop-down options, and then the orange are automatically calculated. So I'll show you examples of each of those. So under the project description, you have a drop-down option for the project sponsor agency. The other thing I wanted to point out is the project name. So we're going to add something in there. One thing I just wanted to note about those two fields is that at the bottom of each of the worksheets, your sponsor agency and the project name will be automatically filled out. That way, if you do choose to print this to a PDF or something like that, save it as a PDF, all of that information will always be on every page. Another thing I want to point out is that in previous calls for projects, we have had separate applications for each funding type, but we do have just the one application for all funding types in this call. And so this question, which funding source will you be applying for, you'll fill that in with the eligible funding source. Also, the next section is the brief description of the project scope. And so this is intended to be just clarifying what will be completed within the scope of the project. Any of the why of your project, why you chose it or why it's a good project, will be shown in other places of the application. But this is intended to really just be specifying what you're doing. So construction of 10-foot wide trail for X number of miles. This type of project description will help us when we go to program projects into the transportation improvement program. And so we do limit it to, I have it limited to 330 characters. So try to be concise in specifying, what is included in that. There are just a few of the fields that do have that character limit, and that is specified for each of those. So 60 character limit for project name, 330 for the description. Then this detailed project description where you can go into a little bit more of the why of the project. That's 2,000 characters, and any of the others are also shown there as well. So looking at the funding section, you are able to choose from the drop-down which funding program you're applying for. And then a couple of things I want to note when you are filling out this funding table. We request that you make sure that you're in alignment with the amount of funding that is available for that funding program in the years that you're applying for. So for instance, with the carbon reduction program, the maximum request is $2.5 million. But we ask that you do not fill out $2.5 million in only 1 year, because it's not available all in 1 year. You want to specify the max, double check and make sure that the maximum that you have doesn't exceed the maximum for that fiscal year. So wanted to just show how this calculates within the table here. So these orange cells over on the right hand side will automatically calculate with the total from each of the previous cells. So you can check those to see what those are actually adding. But also when you look at these cells down here, the total project cost will total everything in this total column. It also will pull the total local funding from each of these two lines, and then the total funding request is just that federal funding line. As I mentioned before, the local match for all of these funding programs is 17.21%. And so this cell here is intended to help you calculate that match. So this includes that formula that I showed in the PowerPoint presentation. And this is pulling your total federal request and making the calculation based on that. And so we do request that you fill out your local match based on the amount of funding per fiscal year. So this is only calculating the total amount of local match that you need across each of these years, but the 17.21% should match the federal request that you have per year. So this is intended to help kind of double check to make sure that your local match line here is that 17.21%. Anything above and beyond the 17.21% would be considered local overmatch. So even if your project is $5 million, anything above and beyond the federal request and the local match would be considered local overmatch. And we also have a section here that is asking what the minimum federal award for the project you can accept is, and then also asking how the scope of the project would change if you had to scale that project back. So that will help when we go into the scoring committee to make sure that projects can still move forward if they're only awarded partial funding. For this partnerships section here, this is asking for what type of partner will be included in the project. As a reminder, there is a certain amount of points in the scoring criteria that are awarded to partnerships, but that is only financial contributions of those partnerships. So there's the specification that a partner must contribute a certain percentage, I think it's 10% of the required local match to be considered for those partnership points. So if you do have a financial partner, you would also want to list that in this partnership section. The bottom of this worksheet here is for projects that will require the CDOT concurrence. So as a reminder, that's ITS projects or projects impacting a state facility. If your project does not qualify under that, you would not need to fill out this section. All right, so moving on, we have the next tab, which is project requirements. So as a reminder, that project description is due both on August 25th and also due with your full application. The rest of these tabs are only due with the full application by the due date. So this is just some of the other information that we need to know for projects, right-of-way, environmental considerations, operations, but then also the anticipated project milestone dates you must fill out here as well. This also gives you an area to check the required attachments. And so these required attachments are anything that is outside of this workbook. Next, we have the project justification. And so this is going through all the areas of the scoring criteria and giving you the opportunity to not only include the data that is required for all of the scoring criteria, but then also providing a narrative for any information that you think is relevant to that scoring criteria that is not reflected in any of these other cells here. So a couple things I wanted to point out with this in the crash rate section. I will be showing you the data tool that we created that will give you these outputs. And so if you're using the NFR-MPO data, you'd be able to just fill out the weighted crash value from that data tool. The years of the crash data that we have provided is 2016 to 2020, and that is, I believe that's shown in the tool. And then this data source would be NFR-MPO. Same with the AADT. There is a question in the chat. Is it possible that a project can apply for multiple funding sources? How would this be shown on the applications? Are 2 applications needed? yes, I would say that 2 applications are needed. You know, most of the information would be the same, but as far as the funding tables, you would need 2 separate applications because they would also be decided with the scoring based on those funding programs. So especially, so if you are applying for multiple funding sources, I would, back on the project description here, make sure to specify, you know, if you're only awarded under one funding program, is the project still able to go through? Are you only able to complete the project if you are awarded under both funding programs? Being really specific as far as what that is going to look like. Also, if there are any questions about how that'll work out with this, please reach out to me, and we're happy to help look at the application to make sure that we have all the information we need. So one of the things that we had talked about a few times under the crash information is that you are able to provide your own crash data instead of using the NFR-MPO data. We know that that is could be a little bit out of date, and there are some agencies that have more up-to-date data. So if that is what you're choosing to use, we ask you to specify the years of crash data and the data source that you're using, and then you can fill out each of these cells so that we can calculate that weighted crash value. For the AADT, you'll see this when I show you the data tool, but the time period of the AADT, we're using 2018 data in our data tool. That's kind of as a surrogate to using an average over the years of the crash data that we have. So we have our crash data is 2016 to 2020, so the midpoint of that, the average of that is going to be the 2018 data. So we ask you to take that similar type of consideration if you're using your own AADT and or your own crash data to use that similar type of average for that volume. All right, and so most of the project justification is going to be kind of that short answer, being able to fill out the information. The most prevalent crash type, we also have that data within our data tool. So you'll be able to pull that information from the data tool into your application. Any of the kind of location-specific information that we are asking for, we have provided that within that data tool. So the activity centers, the freight corridors, any of that information you will be able to pull from the data tool. And so I'll walk through that and what that looks like in a little bit. So then there are some of the areas that some of the questions you also have the option of not applicable. So if you have a trail project, you would choose not applicable under this roadway projects field. You know, same with transit projects. If you have a roadway project, trails projects, things like that. And then we also have the areas that you can provide additional description on how your project will contribute to each of those criteria. So I think that was all I wanted to highlight here. Moving on to the performance measure analysis. This is pretty similar to what we have done in the last few calls, where you are able to choose if your project will contribute to that performance measure, and then so yes, no, or not applicable, and then you can provide any additional information on how your project will contribute to that performance measure. Wanted to point out that there are certain performance measures that are limited to what the extent is of what that performance measure covers. So for pavement condition, that's only for national highway system. And so if your project is on one of our regional corridors that's not part of the NHS, you would select not applicable for this. A couple of the other ones that I want to note is that the CMAQ emissions reductions, that is only for CMAQ projects. And so for any other project, even if it does contribute to the reduction of pollution, the emissions, that would be considered not applicable because this specific CMAQ emissions reductions performance measure is limited to only the CMAQ program. The other one I wanted to point out is the traffic congestion measures. Those are new that were adopted in the last year. This is for the Fort Collins transportation management area only. So any projects that are located outside of the Fort Collins TMA would also choose not applicable. Going down to the regional performance measures, most of them are going to be system-wide, although some of them are looking specifically at the regionally significant corridors. And so that's just looking at, the full NFR-MPO area. Lastly, in this workbook, we have the equity analysis. And so this, once again, is similar to what we've been doing the last few calls. But there are the options to select yes or no. The project located within a quarter mile of an equity index area, that will be one of the outputs from the application data tool. So I'll show you that in a little bit. And then the rest of these are yes or no, but then we have the areas to be able to fill out additional anticipated burdens and benefits for your project, and then also the outreach that will be completed, outreach that has been completed for this project or will be completed for the project as well. And the information for the performance measure analysis and the equity analysis are some of it, the full application package will be what the scoring committee takes in consideration for your project. But those two specifically are what we need for to meet federal requirements for our transportation improvement program. So a lot of that is information for the NFR-MPO to make sure that we are awarding funding to projects that are meeting our goals. So before I go into the application data tool, just wanted to see if there was any questions about the application workbook itself. Okay, I will go ahead and pull up the project website and talk through this a little bit. So this is what was sent out in the notice of the call opening, this Call for Projects website, and this is where really all of the information lives for the Call for Projects. You're able to download the guidebook to access the application data tool. We also have GIS shapefile data downloads available if you choose to use those for your application, either in addition to or instead of using the application data tool. But then also you can download the application workbook, and they're linked up here. We have the schedule up there as well. And then also you can access all of those things down here as well. Following this meeting, we will also have the recording available on this website for anybody to reference. So I wanted to go through the demonstration of the application data tool. So I have that pulled up here, and so it opens up to this splash screen that just kind of gives some basic information about the data tool. So we'll go ahead and start. The instructions will automatically open up, but if you close out of that, you can always access it again by just clicking the little I information button there. We have a full step-by-step user's guide that you can access through this link here, and it's also linked on that the Call for Projects page and within the guidebook. So we'll go ahead and open that up. I won't walk through this now, but it does show just how to use the tool, all of what each of the icons means and how to use them. And then it gives a step-by-step guide on how to use the tool. So I am going to go through this, but if you need to reference how to specifically do anything, that should all be answered in here. So we'll go back to the tool and I will show you, I'll walk through the 2 different ways that you can use the tool for your application. So there are 2 ways that you're able to add your project location to the map. The first is to upload a shapefile. If you choose this option, it's not required, but if you do, the first thing you want to do is unclick the Generalized Features for Web Display, and then you want to browse and upload your shapefile for your project. So we have an example here that we'll go ahead and upload, and it added that to the map. So for this project, we have 3 locations at 3 different intersections. This is just an example. And so after you've done that, you'll click on your project, click on the ellipsis down here, and you'll set location. After you set location, it shows all of the different outputs that are within a quarter mile of that project location. So for example, with this project, if you only had, the 1 point, that would be all you needed to do. If you did have multiple points or multiple line segments, you would find the second one, click it, click the ellipsis, and then add or remove location. So now both of those are highlighted, and then you can do that with the third one as well. And so then that's pulling the information, all of the data that you need within a quarter mile of all 3 of those locations. So the outputs from this tool are all listed in the tabs across here. So first we have our regional corridors. So this is showing what is located within a quarter mile of your project location, the regionally significant corridors, regional active transportation corridors, and regional transit corridors. And then it also pulls that weighted crash value. So what this shows is that there were 9 crashes, and your weighted value for those crashes is 10.25. And the weighted crash value is based on the number of fatalities, number of serious injuries, and then also the presence of a vulnerable road user. And so that is, as I'd mentioned before, somebody that is walking or biking. And so if it is a crash that had a serious injury, and there was a vulnerable road user present, that added an additional 0.25 to that value. If there was a fatality that within that crash, that would add 0.5. And so if you're using your own crash data, I would recommend reaching out to me if you have any questions about that. But as I'd mentioned within the application, you're able to just fill out that information and we would create that weighted crash value for you. If you're using just the data that's within this tool, you will take that weighted value and plug that into your application. So next we would have the AADT. And so for this project, it gets a little messy there, but just because there are so many different locations. But we want to have the average of your location. So for these projects, you would have each of the legs of your intersections, and you would average that. For the 3 project locations, you would average those 3 scores. And so along the bottom here, it will show you which roads that's pulling from. So let's look at Columbia here. So we have 287, Highway 287, which is 40,000, and then Columbia, which is 2,300. So that's the information that you would plug in to the application. Next, we have the crash types. So this is to fill out the information of the most prominent crash type. So with all of the crash types here, you do have just one of each of these types of crash types. So within your application, I would recommend listing that, or if you have more information on the crash types that you're seeing at your project location, you can include that in the narrative as well. If there was one that had a score of 3 or 4, that is what you would want to include as the most prevalent crash type. And then in your application, you would include what countermeasure you're choosing to address that crash type. Next, we have the equity index. And so this is the cumulative equity index score. And so because we're looking at multiple locations here, it's pulling the total of the scores from each of those census block groups. And that is the information that you would put in the application for that cumulative equity index score. On the equity analysis, you would also use this to see whether just the yes or no if it's within a quarter mile, which these are. Next, we have the activity centers. So it pulls what's in a quarter mile of those activity centers. Along the right-hand side here, you have the option of turning on and off the different layers. So for this one, we could turn on the activity centers, and it shows what activity centers are within a quarter mile there. And you can toggle those all on and off. Next, we have the freight corridors. So this is yes or no on whether or not it's located on a freight corridor. Same with the CMP, Congestion Management Process Congested Corridor. And then the NHS, whether or not it's on an NHS, and this can help you when you're looking at the performance measure impact to know whether or not your project is on a national highway system and whether or not it would contribute to those specific performance measure targets. Last is the NFR-MPO priority corridor. And so this is one of the questions within the application workbook as well. So as I'd mentioned, there are 2 ways that you can show your project location. So we'll go ahead and click back to the project location here, and you can always choose the option to start over. And so that's going to clear all of your data, and then you can start over. So the next option that we're able to do is to draw our project location. So we'll choose that option, draw and analyze. And depending on your project type, you'll choose either to draw a point, draw a line, or draw a polygon. And so for the polygon, that could be a couple different things. Most of our projects are going to be either points or lines, but for something like a study or possibly a bus purchase project, you could choose your service area of the transit agency by drawing that polygon of your full service area. So we'll go ahead and choose a point. We will zoom into our project location, and then you click and it adds the point, and it pulls all of that same data that we had just gone over. With some project locations, if there is not one of the areas within a quarter mile of your project location, that tab will be grayed out and you will not have the option to click on that. And so then when you go to fill out your project application, you would select no for that option because there is not an activity center within a 1/4 mile of your project location. Once again, you can always hit start over if you want to choose a different project type. So we'll go ahead and choose line. So if you're doing a line project, you would click once to start drawing the line, pull to the end of your project location, and double click to complete. And then it pulls the 1/4 mile buffer of that project location and gives you all of that same information. So you can fill out your application just by looking through each of the tabs here, but then you're also able to create a report of all of this information. And that's what the little printer is here. One thing I will note is that you do also have the option of downloading the information. When you're in this project location tab, if you click the download all, that's going to download separate Excel documents for each of these tabs. I would not necessarily recommend that. Our recommendation is to use just this create report function instead. Also, if you are within any one of these tabs, this download button would just download an Excel spreadsheet for that one tab. So then back in the project location, we'll click the create report. We will fill out a name for the report. Click OK. And it creates a PDF report that you can save or print of all of the information that is included within the tool. And so all projects will be required to fill in the application, but if you also wanted to include this report as an attachment, you are more than welcome to do that. I did want to wait a second while this loads because it will also show a little location map. So I wanted to show that before we moved on. It is taking a minute. While that is thinking, there we go. So it shows a map of your project location. So just wanted to show that. All right, so I wanted to open it up for any questions about using this application data tool. If there's no questions about that specifically, that was the end of my presentation today. So I did want to open it up to questions in general about anything that we've talked about today. If there was something that I did not cover that you had a question about, anything related to the call for projects, I'll open that up to questions now. And if there are no questions at all, we can go ahead and end the workshop. I will note that at our TAC meeting next Wednesday, we will have a time for question and answers. So if in the next week you are working through any of the application and have questions, for one, you can always reach out to me. Any questions we ask be sent to planning@nfrmpo.org. You can also call me if you have any questions that you wanted to talk through, but then also during our TAC meeting, we'll have time to talk about any questions that we have. Or if you have questions for other project sponsors, you'd be able to ask those as well. And if there are no questions, we will go ahead and end. Thank you everybody for joining me today.